Ever wondered what getting engaged was like before diamond rings and Instagram posts? Can you imagine a world where marriage proposals involve drinking blood or exchanging shoes? Number 11. Blood oaths and mingled cups. Did you know medieval couples sometimes drank each other's blood? In some remote European regions, particularly among Germanic tribes, during the early medieval period, betrothal ceremonies occasionally included the ritual mixing of blood. Couples would make small cuts on their palms or wrists, allowing their blood to mingle in a special cup filled with wine or mead. They would then drink from this cup together, symbolizing their lives becoming one. This practice wasn't just romantic in a vampire novel kind of way. It represented one of the most binding contracts possible. Blood oaths were considered unbreakable, transcending even written documents in a time when many couldn't read. The Church eventually condemned these practices as pagan rituals, but they persisted in isolated areas well into the 13th century. In Norse traditions, blood brotherhood ceremonies followed similar protocols, and these rituals were adapted for betrothals as Christianity slowly replaced older beliefs. Archaeological evidence from burial sites in Denmark and northern Germany has revealed cups with traces of human blood mixed with alcoholic beverages, suggesting these weren't just legendary tales but actual practices. The blood mingling wasn't only about binding agreements, it carried deep spiritual significance. Many believed that exchanging blood created a connection that would transcend even death, ensuring couples would find each other in the afterlife. Some medieval texts describe how families would preserve these special cups as heirlooms, bringing them out at future family weddings to remind the new couple of their ancestors' unbreakable bonds. Chronicles from the time tell of couples who, when separated by war or famine, would touch their blood oath scars for comfort, believing they could somehow feel their beloved through this connection. In regions where Christianity had stronger influence, the blood ritual was gradually replaced with the less controversial practice of drinking from a shared wine cup, which eventually evolved into the traditional wedding toast we still recognize today. Number 10. Shoe exchanges and footwear symbolism. Ever thought your shoes could legally bind you to someone else? In medieval England and parts of Scandinavia, exchanging shoes or placing one shoe next to another's formed a legitimate part of betrothal ceremonies. This wasn't just symbolic, it was legally recognized. When a woman accepted a man's shoe and wore it, she was publicly acknowledging her acceptance of his authority in their future household. Similarly, when a man walked in a woman's shoe, even just a few steps, he symbolically experienced life from her perspective, showing a commitment to understand and care for her needs. Court records from 15th century England actually reference disputed engagements where shoe exchanges were cited as evidence of binding agreements. The type of shoe mattered enormously. Wealthy families might commission specially decorated betrothal shoes, often dyed with expensive colors or embellished with meaningful symbols. These weren't just for the ceremony. Many women would preserve their betrothal shoes for life, sometimes even requesting burial with them. The practice had practical origins in property transfer. Stepping into someone's shoes literally represented stepping into their legal rights and responsibilities. In Norse territories, the groom would place his shoe next to the bride during the ceremony, then return it to his foot, symbolizing that while he maintained authority, they now walked life's path together. Some regions took this further. In parts of medieval Germany, families would display the couple's shoes in their window after the betrothal, announcing the upcoming marriage to the community. Stealing these shoes was considered extremely bad luck, not just for the thief but for the entire village. Number 9. Handfasting with colored cords. Who knew the phrase, tying the knot, came from literally binding hands together? Handfasting ceremonies, where a couple's hands were bound with colored cords or ribbons, created some of the most visually striking betrothal rituals in medieval Europe. Different regions used specific colors and knot patterns, each carrying symbolic meaning. Red cords represented passion and fertility. White symbolized purity. Gold or yellow stood for wealth and prosperity. Blue signified fidelity. And green represented growth and new beginning. The most binding ceremonies would use cords of all these colors twisted together, creating a rainbow bind that symbolized all aspects of married life. The knots were tied by community elders or religious figures who would recite blessings as each cord was placed. What's particularly fascinating is how handfasting began as temporary marriages in some regions. In Celtic territories, couples could handfast for a year and a day, essentially creating a trial marriage. If, after this period, they wished to separate, they could do so without social stigma. If they chose to remain together, a more permanent ceremony would follow. Manuscript illustrations from the period show elaborate handfasting scenes, with some depicting up to 7 cords being used simultaneously. The patterns in which the cords were wrapped, crossing over hearts, circling wrists multiple times, or creating infinity symbols, were carefully choreographed to invoke specific blessings or protections. In Scottish Highland traditions, the fastened hands would be held above the couple's heads and displayed to gathered witnesses who would cheer their approval. The cords themselves became treasured keepsakes, often wrapped around candles, used at the eventual wedding ceremony, and later, around the cradles of the couple's children, creating a continuous blessing that extended through generation. Number 8. Betrodal Gardens and Living Pledges. Can you imagine planting a tree as your engagement announcement? Across medieval Europe, especially in rural communities, couples would plant trees, vines, or gardens together as living symbols of their betrothal. Oak saplings were favorites for their symbolism of strength and longevity, while fruit trees represented fertility and sustenance. In vineyard regions, couples would plant and tend vine cuttings that would later produce wine for their wedding feast. These living pledges served practical purposes beyond symbolism. They required ongoing care and cooperation, demonstrating the couple's ability to nurture something together. If the plants thrived, it was considered a good omen for the upcoming marriage. The care of betrothal gardens became a community affair. Neighbors would observe how diligently the couple tended their plants, using this as a measure of their readiness for marriage. In some French and Italian villages, damaging another couple's betrothal tree was considered an offense serious enough to warrant public punishment. Historical records show property disputes where ancient trees were cited as boundary markers, with testimony noting they were the betrothal oak of Thomas and Agnes, planted in the 3rd year of King Edward's reign. Some communities developed traditions where fruit from betrothal trees would be shared among villagers at harvest time, as a way of including the broader community in the couple's good fortune. In regions prone to drought or harsh winters, the survival of betrothal plantings through difficult conditions was celebrated as evidence of divine blessing on the union. The most touching accounts come from medieval wills, where elderly widows and widowers leave special instructions for the continued care of trees planted with my beloved on the day we pledged ourselves to one another. Number 7. Broken coins and divided objects. Did you know medieval couples literally broke things to show their commitment? Long before engagement rings became standard, couples would often break coins, medallions, or tokens in half, with each keeping one piece. These broken objects served as physical proof of their agreement to marry. Gold and silver coins were common among wealthier couples, while those of modest means might split wooden tokens carved with personal symbols or initials. The jagged edges of each half would match perfectly, creating a unique fingerprint that couldn't be forged, essentially a medieval security feature. During the wedding ceremony, these halves would be reunited to symbolize the completion of their betrothal promise. Archaeological discoveries throughout Europe have unearthed numerous examples of these split tokens, often found as grave goods, suggesting their immense personal value to the deceased. In Germanic regions, runic inscriptions on these token halves sometimes contained powerful protection spells or love charms. Court records mention cases where broken coins were presented as evidence of binding betrothal agreements when one party attempted to back out. The tradition wasn't limited to coins, pottery, brooches, and even small religious icons were sometimes broken and shared. In merchant families, breaking a coin that came from a distant land represented hopes for prosperity and adventure in the new union. The practice eventually evolved into the Gimel ring, a ring made of two interlocking bands that could be separated during betrothal and rejoined at marriage. These split tokens carried such powerful symbolism that folklore throughout Europe contains tales of separated halves mysteriously finding their way back together, reuniting long-parted lovers against all odds. Number 6. Bread baking and culinary challenges. Could you win someone's hand in marriage with your cooking skills? In many medieval communities, particularly throughout Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, a woman's bread baking abilities were considered crucial evidence of her readiness for marriage. Elaborate betrothal ceremonies included the prospective bride preparing special loaves, often decorated with intricate designs, seeds, and symbols of fertility and prosperity. These weren't just any loaves. They followed specific recipes passed down through generations with techniques known only to women in certain families. The quality of these betrothal loaves was judged not just by the groom's family, but often by community elders, whose approval was necessary for the engagement to proceed. In Slavic regions, a prospective bride might bake a korolvaj, a large, elaborately decorated bread featuring birds, flowers, and intertwined rings that symbolize the joining of two families. Historical accounts describe some loaves so beautiful that families would delay eating them, displaying the bread as proof of the bride's exceptional skills. The most fascinating aspect was how the man's family would sometimes set deliberate challenges, providing less than ideal ingredients or imposing time constraints to test how the woman performed under pressure. In Mediterranean communities, olive harvest betrothals were common, with prospective brides demonstrating their ability to cure olives and press oil alongside their bread-making skills. Some regions turned this into a two-way test, with the man required to provide the grain he had harvested himself, demonstrating his ability to provide sustenance for his future family. Folk songs from the period celebrate particularly memorable betrothal feasts, where a bride's exceptional bread saved a family from changing their mind about a match, or conversely, where poor baking revealed incompatibility before a marriage could take place. Number 5. Bed trials and furniture ceremonies. Would you believe testing a bed was once a formal part of getting engaged? In several regions across medieval Europe, particularly in Germanic and Scandinavian areas, couples would participate in a ceremonial bed showing or bed trial as part of their betrothal. This wasn't nearly as scandalous as it sounds to modern ears. The couple, fully clothed and chaperoned by family members, would sit or lie briefly on the bed they would share after marriage, while witnesses sang special songs and offered blessings for fertility and harmony. The bed itself was often newly constructed by the groom or his family specifically for this purpose, and examining its craftsmanship was considered an important part of evaluating his worthiness as a provider. In wealthier households, this bed ceremony became quite elaborate. The marriage bed would be displayed with its finest linens, often including handmade quilts and coverlets created by the bride and female relatives that told stories through their patterns and stitching. Guests would place symbols of prosperity, coins, grain, fruit, and nuts on the bed while reciting blessings. In some regions, small children were encouraged to jump on the bed, briefly transferring their youthful energy and fertility to the couple. Written accounts from medieval Germany describe how community members would sometimes place a segment of wedding bread or cake under the mattress during these ceremonies, which the couple would later share on their wedding night. The bed trial wasn't just symbolic. It served as physical confirmation that the groom had prepared a proper dwelling for his bride. Historical records show disputed betrothals where the absence of this bed ceremony was cited as evidence that no proper engagement had taken place, suggesting its legal significance beyond mere tradition. Number 4. Contract negotiations and dowry bins. Think, modern prenups are complicated. Medieval betrothal contracts make them look like child's play. While romantic notions of love exist in medieval literature, historical records show that marriage alliances, particularly among property-owning families, involved extensive negotiations that could last months or even years. These weren't just verbal agreements. They produced written contracts specifying exactly what each family would contribute from land and livestock to household goods and currency. The physical signing of these documents became ceremonial events themselves, often involving dozens of witnesses and elaborate feasting. In many regions, literacy was uncommon, so the contract would be read aloud multiple times to ensure all parties understood the commitments being made. What made these negotiations truly fascinating was the dowry display. Tradition practiced across much of Europe. The bride's family would publicly present and inventory every item of her dowry: clothing, linens, cookware, furniture, jewelry, arranging them in elaborate displays that neighbors would be invited to view. These displays weren't just about showing wealth. They established community knowledge of exactly what a woman brought into her marriage, protecting her property rights should disputes arise later. Court records from medieval Italy describe cases where women reclaimed specific items after a husband's death by calling witnesses who had seen those same items at the betrothal dowry display years earlier. The most valuable dowry items were often displayed for several days or even weeks, with community members taking turns, standing guard against theft. In some Mediterranean communities, prospective brides spent years creating elaborate hope chests filled with handmade linens and clothing, and the quality of these items directly reflected on their family's standing. Historical accounts describe particularly grand dowry displays that included processions through town streets with items carried on decorated carts, essentially turning the betrothal into a public festival that reinforced social hierarchies within the community. Number 3. Animal gifts and livestock exchanges. Could you imagine your engagement involving the gift of a goat? Across rural medieval Europe, livestock exchanges formed crucial components of betrothal ceremonies. The specific animals varied by region. In pastoral areas, sheep or goats were common. In agricultural communities, draft animals like oxen held greater value, while in hunting communities, trained hawks or hounds might be exchanged. These weren't simply economic transactions. The health, temperament, and breeding potential of these animals were seen as reflections of the family's honor and indicators of the marriage's future prosperity. Historical records show that hiding an animal's defects during betrothal exchanges could be grounds for breaking engagements or even triggering blood feuds between families. The symbolic aspects of these exchanges were just as important as their practical value. In many regions, the direction of gift-giving carried specific meaning. Animals moving from the bride's family to the groom's symbolized fertility and nurturing qualities she would bring to the marriage, while animals from the groom's family represented his ability to provide protection and sustenance. Some communities practiced rituals where the couple would together lead their newly exchanged animals to water or feeding grounds, demonstrating their cooperative abilities before witnesses. Norse sagas describe elaborate betrothal ceremonies where specially bred horses were exchanged, with the animals' bloodlines recited as part of the formal proceedings. Archaeological evidence from medieval farmsteads occasionally reveals ritualized burials of animals beneath threshold stones, with researchers theorizing these represent sacrificed betrothal gifts intended to bring blessing to the household. Particularly touching are medieval wills that specifically mention animals received during betrothals decades earlier, suggesting the deep sentimental value these creatures held beyond their practical worth. Number 2. Prayer book exchanges and literary betrothals. Did you know medieval books could cost as much as a house? Among the educated elite of medieval Europe, presenting an illuminated prayer book or book of hours was one of the most significant betrothal gifts possible. These hand-created manuscripts represented enormous investments. A single, elaborately decorated book might take a year or more to produce and cost as much as a small farm. What made these gifts especially meaningful was their customization. Prospective grooms would commission books featuring saints significant to the bride's family or illustrations depicting the couple together in prayer. Surviving examples show touching personalization. Margins decorated with the couple's combined heraldry, illuminated initials intertwining their names, and dedication pages with heartfelt pledges of devotion. These literary betrothals weren't limited to prayer books. Among the particularly scholarly, exchanging books of poetry, philosophy, or natural history demonstrated intellectual compatibility. Some of these books contained hidden messages, certain passages underlined or annotated to communicate private sentiments between the couple. For noble families with political alliances at stake, these books served dual purposes, with seemingly innocent religious texts containing subtle diplomatic messages through their choice of imagery and included prayers. Historical inventories from medieval libraries occasionally note books described as the betrothal gift of Lady Margaret or similar designations, showing how these items maintained their special status for generations. In certain court circles, literary betrothal traditions grew increasingly complex, with couples exchanging a series of books over time, each responding to themes or questions raised in previous volumes, essentially conducting extended philosophical conversations that demonstrated their compatibility of mind. The most treasured of these books show physical evidence of frequent use, worn pages at favorite passages, wax drips from reading by candlelight, and sometimes additional notes added through decades of marriage, transforming them into ongoing records of a relationship. Number 1. Witness processions and community validations. Did your entire town attend your engagement? In medieval communities, where written documentation was limited and legal systems less formalized, public witnessing of betrothals was essential to their legitimacy. Elaborate witness processions would form a core part of engagement ceremonies, with couples literally parading through villages or town streets, stopping at predetermined locations where formal declarations of intent to marry would be repeated. These weren't casual strolls. They followed carefully planned routes passing the homes of the most respected community members, religious landmarks, and sites associated with local governance. At each stopping point, specific community members would step forward to acknowledge the betrothal, sometimes adding their own blessings or condition. The size and composition of these processions carried enormous significance. The presence of guild masters, religious figures, and local officials conveyed social approval, while their absence could indicate concerns about the match. Communities developed complex traditions around these processions. In some regions, obstacles would be deliberately placed in the couple's path, which they had to overcome together, symbolizing their readiness to face life's challenges. Children might scatter specific herbs or grains before the couple, while in some territories mock attacks would be staged by friends, requiring the groom to symbolically defend his bride. Historical court records frequently reference these processions when validating marriages, with testimony like, "I saw them process past St. Martin's Well on Michaelmas, and the blacksmith's guild presented them with iron rings." Some communities maintained betrothal registers, where witnesses would make their marks after these processions, creating rudimentary public records. The most fascinating accounts describe how these processions incorporated local geography into their symbolism. Couples might cross particular bridges, circle certain trees, or drink from specific wells, all actions loaded with cultural meaning that transformed mere movement through space into a community, a mudit. Ever wondered what happened when these elaborate rituals went wrong? What would you do if your betrothal bread collapsed, or your handfast cord snapped during the ceremony?